The year 1099 shimmered with the dust of conquest, as the First Crusade, a tumultuous wave of faith and fervor, finally crashed upon the ancient walls of Jerusalem. Long before the intricate stonework of later centuries or the imposing silhouettes that would one day define the Holy Land skyline, the victorious Crusaders found themselves in a city both hallowed and vulnerable. Their initial strongholds were born not of grand architectural vision, but of urgent necessity, often little more than hastily repaired breaches in existing walls or repurposed structures. Imagine the scene: the clamor of exhausted soldiers, the scent of parched earth and distant fires, as they looked upon a city whose very stones seemed to breathe history. Their victory, hard-won and bloody, presented an immediate paradox. They had seized Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of their pilgrimage, but now they had to hold it. The surrounding territories, a patchwork of hostile emirates and wary local populations, posed an ever-present threat. The early Crusader presence was tenuous, a fragile foothold in a vast and unfamiliar landscape. Their first castles were, by modern standards, rudimentary. Many were adaptations of existing Byzantine or Arab fortifications, their defenses patched and strengthened with whatever materials were at hand. A prime example was the Tower of David, already an ancient structure, which quickly became the citadel of the new Latin kingdom. It was not built by the Crusaders, but rather reinforced and manned by them, its formidable bulk offering a crucial defensive anchor in the freshly conquered city. This period, roughly from 1099 to the early 1100s, was characterized by improvisation and adaptation. The Crusaders, primarily Frankish knights and their retinues, were warriors, not master masons. Their knowledge of siegecraft was extensive, but their experience in constructing permanent, sophisticated fortifications on such a grand scale was limited. They relied heavily on local labor, often conscripted, and on the expertise of indigenous builders who understood the nuances of the region's stone and climate. This often meant a blend of Western military objectives with Eastern construction techniques, a fascinating cross-cultural exchange born of immediate need. One might picture the early Crusader lords surveying their new domains, their minds undoubtedly wrestling with the immense logistical challenge of securing their gains. They needed to protect supply routes, guard against counterattacks, and establish a network of strongpoints across a vast and often unforgiving terrain. The very concept of a Crusader castle was still in its infancy, evolving from the simpler Motte and Bailey designs familiar in Western Europe to something far more complex and durable, suited to the harsh realities of the Levant. Consider the early efforts outside Jerusalem itself. As the Latin kingdom expanded its control, small garrisons were established in strategic locations. These were often simple watchtowers or fortified houses, strategically placed to overlook vital roads or fertile valleys. For instance, the Castle of Ramla, established not long after the fall of Jerusalem, was initially a modest fortification, designed to control the route between Jerusalem and the port of Jaffa. Its early form would have been far less imposing than the later, more elaborate structures, perhaps a square tower surrounded by a palisade or a simple curtain wall, a testament to the immediate need for security rather than architectural grandeur. Historians still debate the precise extent of Crusader architectural innovation in these very early years. Some argue that the Crusaders brought with them advanced military engineering concepts from Europe, while others suggest they largely adopted and refined existing local methods. What is clear, however, is that the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade saw a rapid evolution in their understanding of fortification. He constant threat of Muslim counteroffensives, particularly from Egyptian Fatimids and Syrian Seljuks, provided a brutal education in defensive architecture. Every skirmish, every siege, offered lessons in the vulnerabilities of their hastily erected defenses and the strengths of their enemies' tactics. It's easy to imagine the daily life within these nascent strongholds, the constant vigilance, the rhythmic clang of hammers as repairs were made, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, the hushed conversations in a mix of Old French, Latin, and Arabic. These were not just military outposts, they were often the nuclei of new settlements, drawing in merchants, artisans, and farmers seeking the protection offered by the Crusader presence. The walls, however crude, represented a fragile promise of stability in a volatile world. One lesser-known detail from this period concerns the role of religious orders in early fortification. While the great military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitaller would later become synonymous with monumental castles, their initial involvement was more focused on protecting pilgrims and maintaining hospices. However, their growing wealth and military prowess quickly led them to acquire and fortify strategic points. Their early structures, though not yet the massive fortresses they would later command, were often among the most robust due to their disciplined organization and access to resources. For example, the earliest Hospitaller presence in Jerusalem was centered around their hospital, which itself required significant defensive measures to protect its valuable assets and the pilgrims it served. The early 12th century saw the gradual consolidation of Crusader power, and with it, a more systematic approach to defense. As the initial chaos subsided, the Crusader lords began to think beyond immediate survival and towards long-term control. This meant investing in more permanent structures, drawing on the lessons learned from their early experiences. The simple towers and repaired walls began to give way to more sophisticated designs, though still modest compared to the colossal castles of the mid-12th century. The focus remained on strategic placement, controlling access to water sources, protecting agricultural lands, and securing vital communication lines between the major cities of the Latin Kingdom. Perhaps these early stones, now often buried beneath later additions or reduced to foundations, whispered stories to the stars, tales of desperate sieges, of weary sentinels scanning the horizon, of the gradual transformation of a conquering army into a resident power. The genesis of Crusader castles was not a sudden, grand architectural statement, but a slow, organic growth driven by the relentless pressures of survival and the evolving understanding of how to hold a kingdom in a land that constantly sought to reclaim itself. The very ground beneath their feet, steeped in millennia of history, seemed to challenge their presence, forcing them to build with a resilience that mirrored their own determination. The transition from makeshift defenses to purpose-built fortifications was a gradual process, influenced by a combination of factors: the increasing availability of skilled labor, the accumulation of wealth within the Crusader states, and the ever-present military threat. This period laid the foundational principles for what would become the distinctive style of Crusader military architecture, a unique blend of European and Middle Eastern influences. Forged in the crucible of constant warfare, the rudimentary strongholds of 1099 were the humble ancestors of the mighty fortresses that would soon dominate the landscape, each stone a testament to the enduring struggle for control of the Holy Land. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The dust of conquest had barely settled, yet the new masters of Jerusalem, the Crusaders, understood that holding the city was as vital as taking it. Their eyes, still alight with the fervor of their holy victory, now turned to the practicalities of defense. The city, though captured, was far from secure. Its walls, battered by siege engines and undermined by sappers, bore the scars of the recent struggle. Rebuilding and fortifying Jerusalem itself became an immediate and paramount task, even before their gaze truly turned to the broader landscape. The very air of Jerusalem seemed to hum with the echoes of its long, tumultuous past, a history etched into every stone. The Crusaders found a city already layered with the remnants of empires: Roman, Byzantine, Arab. Their initial efforts weren't to build entirely anew, but to adapt and strengthen what was already there, a testament to the enduring strategic importance of certain locations. The most critical of these, without question, was the Temple Mount, or as it was known to the Muslims, Haram al-Sharif. For the Crusaders, this elevated plateau, once the site of Solomon's Temple and Herod's magnificent Reconstruction, held profound spiritual significance. They believed it to be the very heart of their faith's origin, the place where Christ himself had walked. Yet, its practical value as a defensive stronghold was equally undeniable. Its sheer size and elevated position offered commanding views over much of the city and its surroundings. The massive retaining walls, built by Herod millennia before, were still largely intact, forming an almost impregnable perimeter on three sides. Within days of the conquest, the Crusaders began to transform the sacred precinct. The Dome of the Rock, which they mistakenly believed to be the Temple of Solomon, was stripped of its Islamic ornamentation, its golden dome dulled by neglect, and a cross was placed atop it. It was consecrated as a church, the Templum Domini, the Lord's Temple. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, at the southern end of the platform, became the Templum Solomonis, Solomon's Temple. This building, with its long vaulted chambers beneath, known as the Stables of Solomon, proved particularly useful. These subterranean spaces, originally built as substructures to expand the platform, were indeed large enough to house horses, and the Crusaders quickly adapted them for this purpose, leading to the enduring legend that the Knights Templar, when they were later granted headquarters here, derived their name from this very location. The immediate focus was on repairing breaches in the city walls. The northern wall, having borne the brunt of the siege, required urgent attention. Stones dislodged by catapults were reset, and sections that had crumbled were rebuilt, often hastily, using whatever materials were at hand, including stones from damaged buildings within the city. The Crusaders, though devout, were also pragmatic. They understood that their hold on the holy city was tenuous, surrounded as they were by a hostile Muslim world. Every hour spent strengthening the defenses was an hour bought against future assault. The city's gates, too, were reinforced. These vulnerable points, where the walls could be most easily breached, were given extra attention. Portcullises were installed, and the gates themselves were thickened with timbers and iron. Towers flanking the gates were heightened and strengthened, providing better vantage points for archers and a more formidable barrier to any approaching enemy. The Tower of David, the ancient citadel at the western entrance to the city, became the primary Crusader stronghold within Jerusalem. Its massive, ancient stones, some dating back to the Hasmonean period, formed an almost indestructible core. The Crusaders added their own layers of defense, including a moat and a drawbridge, and built new towers atop the existing foundations, further enhancing its already formidable presence. It served not only as a military headquarters, but also as the residence for the Latin Patriarch and at times the Crusader kings themselves. Beyond the immediate repairs, the Crusaders began to think about a more systematic fortification. They recognized that the existing walls, while strong, did not fully encompass all the areas they deemed vital, nor did they always follow the most defensible contours of the land. For instance, the northern wall, though repaired, was still seen as a weak point, as it ran across relatively flat ground, making it more susceptible to siege engines. This understanding would later lead to more ambitious rebuilding projects, but in these initial years, the priority was simply to make the city secure enough to withstand an immediate counterattack. One of the lesser-known details of this early period of fortification is the reuse of ancient cisterns and underground passages. Jerusalem was crisscrossed with a network of these, some dating back to the Canaanite period, designed to collect and store precious rainwater. The Crusaders, with their practical military minds, quickly recognized their dual potential as emergency water supplies during a siege, and in some cases as concealed routes for sallying forth or for communication within the walls. Some of these passages were adapted and integrated into the defensive system, though their full extent and use remain somewhat mysterious to modern archaeologists. Perhaps these hidden ways whispered stories to the stars, unseen by the new occupiers, yet silently serving their purpose. The population of Jerusalem itself was a mix of faiths, though the Muslim and Jewish communities had been largely massacred or expelled during the conquest. The remaining inhabitants were a blend of local Christians, many of whom were Eastern Orthodox, and the newly arrived Latin Crusaders. The rebuilding efforts provided work for many, though often under duress. The labor was hard, the sun relentless, and the threat of renewed conflict ever present. Yet brick by brick, stone by stone, the walls of Jerusalem began to rise again, not merely as physical barriers, but as symbols of the Crusaders' determination to hold their sacred prize. Historians still disagree whether the Crusaders fully grasped the sophisticated hydraulic systems that underpinned Jerusalem's ancient water supply, particularly the complex aqueducts that brought water from distant springs. While they certainly utilized the cisterns within the city, their understanding of the larger network seems to have been limited. Some scholars argue that their focus was almost exclusively on immediate military defense, leading them to neglect the long-term strategic importance of controlling external water sources. Others contend that they simply inherited a system that was already in decline and lacked the resources or engineering expertise to fully restore it to its former glory. This debate highlights the challenges of reconstructing the daily practicalities of a medieval city under constant threat. The initial adaptations of existing structures into defensive positions were not limited to the Temple Mount and the Tower of David. Many of the larger stone houses within the city, particularly those near the walls or strategic intersections, were quickly fortified. Their lower windows were bricked up, their upper floors adapted for archers, and their roofs made accessible for patrols. These impromptu strongpoints formed a secondary line of defense, designed to slow an enemy even if the main walls were breached. This pragmatic approach, born of necessity and limited resources, characterized much of the early Crusader presence in Jerusalem. They were building not just a fortress, but a new society, one that had to be constantly vigilant, constantly prepared for attack. The visual landscape of Jerusalem began to change. The clean lines of Islamic architecture were slowly overlaid with the heavier, more utilitarian forms of crusade, or military engineering. The sounds of construction mingled with the chanting of Latin prayers, the clanging of blacksmiths, and the cries of merchants in the newly established markets. The city, which had witnessed so much upheaval, was once again being reshaped by the hands of its latest conquerors. The walls, the gates, the adapted holy sites, all spoke of a new era, one defined by the sword and the cross, and by the unwavering belief that Jerusalem was theirs to hold, come what may. These early years, from roughly 1099 to the mid-12th century, laid the foundational layers of Crusader Jerusalem, a city transformed into a formidable bastion, a testament to their enduring presence in the Holy Land. From the sun-drenched plains of Ascalon, where the echoes of ancient battles still seem to shimmer in the heat, the gaze of the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem turned inward, towards the very sinews and bones that would hold its fragile body together. The Crusaders, once pilgrims and warriors, now found themselves rulers of a land both sacred and perilous. Their initial victories, often swift and brutal, had carved out a presence, but true dominion, they quickly realized, would not be won by the sword alone. It would be forged in stone, rising from the very earth they sought to claim. The foundational castles of the early kingdom were not merely fortifications. They were declarations, etched in mortar and rock, of a permanent presence in a land teeming with adversaries. Imagine the stark beauty of the landscape: rolling hills, deep wadis carved by seasonal rains, and the distant shimmer of the Mediterranean Sea. It was a land of stark contrasts, where fertile valleys gave way to arid plateaus, and ancient trade routes crisscrossed a patchwork of cultures and beliefs. The strategic placement of these early strongholds was paramount, a testament to the tactical acumen of leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon and Baldwin I. They understood that control of the land meant control of its arteries, the roads, the passes, the water sources. One of the earliest and most vital of these strongholds was Ramla, a town situated on the crucial road between Jerusalem and the port of Jaffa. It was a crossroads, a choke point, and a potential staging ground for any attack on the holy city itself. The Crusaders, recognizing its importance, moved quickly to fortify it. While not a massive, sprawling castle in the later sense, its early defenses were robust enough to protect the vital supply lines. The very existence of Ramla as a Crusader outpost ensured that pilgrims and provisions could move with a degree of safety between the coast and Jerusalem, a journey that had once been fraught with danger. This early focus on securing lines of communication and supply would become a recurring theme in Crusader castle building. Further north, the towering presence of Montgisard, though less famous than later behemoths, served a similar purpose. Perched strategically to overlook the coastal plain and the road to Ascalon, it was an early warning system, a sentinel against potential incursions from the south. These initial fortifications were often less about impregnability and more about strategic deterrence and control of movement. They were watchtowers, garrisons, and supply depots all rolled into one, designed to project power and secure territory rather than withstand prolonged sieges by massive armies, which was still a relatively rare occurrence in the nascent kingdom. The engineering principles guiding their construction were, at first, pragmatic and adaptive. The Crusaders were not, by and large, master masons or architects in the Byzantine or Islamic tradition. They learned quickly, however, often incorporating local techniques and materials. Limestone, abundant in the region, became the primary building block. Its natural hardness and availability made it an ideal choice. The earliest castles, often built on existing Roman or Byzantine foundations, were characterized by thick, unadorned walls, often lacking the sophisticated defensive features that would emerge later. These were strong, simple structures, designed for rapid construction and immediate utility. Consider the castle of Ibelin, established around 1141. While later rebuilt and expanded, its initial form was a strong tower and curtain wall, designed to protect the fertile plains around it and serve as a base for the Knights Hospitaller. Its very name, Ibelin, would become synonymous with one of the most powerful baronial families of the kingdom, whose influence radiated from their stone strongholds. These early castles were not just military outposts, they were the nascent cente, rise of feudal power, around which estates and villages would coalesce, drawing sustenance from the protected lands. The challenges of building in a hostile environment were immense. Skilled labor was often scarce, and local populations, while sometimes employed, were not always reliable. Materials had to be quarried, transported, and meticulously fitted. Water, a precious commodity in the arid landscape, had to be secured, often through the construction of cisterns and wells within the castle walls. The very act of building was an act of defiance, a statement of intent. Each stone laid was a commitment to the land, a refusal to be dislodged. One of the most fascinating aspects of this early period is the rapid evolution of defensive architecture. The Crusaders arrived with knowledge of European motte and bailey castles and simple stone keeps, but they quickly adapted to the unique challenges of the Levant. They encountered sophisticated Byzantine and Islamic fortifications, which often featured concentric walls, projecting towers, and complex gatehouses. While they didn't immediately adopt these features wholesale, a process of absorption and innovation began. Historians still disagree whether the Crusaders independently developed some of their later advanced features, or whether they primarily learned and adapted from the existing architectural traditions of the region. It's a debate that highlights the dynamic interplay of cultures in the medieval Middle East. Perhaps one of the most illustrative examples of a foundational castle, both in its strategic importance and its early construction, is the fortress of Safed. Perched high in the Galilee, overlooking the fertile plains and the ancient trade routes leading north, Safed was a crucial stronghold against incursions from Damascus. Its initial construction, likely in the early 12th century, would have been relatively simple, a strong tower and curtain walls, but its strategic placement was undeniable. It was a watchtower, a garrison, and a symbol of Crusader control over the northern reaches of the kingdom. The very air around such places would have been thick with anticipation, the sounds of distant hooves or the cry of a hawk, signaling either peace or peril. These early castles were often built on hilltops or natural eminences, maximizing their defensive advantages. The terrain itself became an ally, with steep slopes and rocky outcrops forming natural barriers. The engineers, limited though they might have been by contemporary technology, understood the principles of elevation and command of the surrounding landscape. They were not merely building walls, they were shaping the land to their will. The construction process itself was a monumental undertaking. Imagine the rhythmic clang of hammers on chisels, the grunts of laborers hauling massive stones, the dust rising in clouds under the relentless sun. It was a symphony of human effort, driven by a desperate need for security and a fervent belief in their cause. The sheer scale of these endeavors, undertaken by a relatively small number of Europeans in a foreign land, is truly remarkable. These were not the vast, well-funded projects of later European monarchs. They were often built with limited resources, relying on the ingenuity and sheer willpower of the Crusaders themselves. Beyond their military function, these castles served as centers of administration and commerce. They were the nuclei around which the feudal society of the Latin East began to form. Within their walls, justice was dispensed, taxes were collected, and trade was regulated. They became focal points for the local population, offering a degree of protection in exchange for loyalty and labor. The sounds within a castle would have been a vibrant tapestry. The clatter of armor, the murmur of prayers, the haggling of merchants, the cries of children. They were miniature worlds, self-contained and self-sufficient, reflecting the diverse elements of the Crusader kingdom. The threat of siege was a constant companion, even in these early days. While the massive siege engines of later centuries were not yet common, smaller raiding parties and skirmishes were an everyday reality. The castles had to be provisioned, their garrisons trained, and their defenses constantly maintained. The vulnerability of these early structures meant that constant vigilance was required. Sentinels would have scanned the horizons from the highest battlements, their eyes accustomed to the subtle shifts in the landscape that might herald an approaching foe. It's worth noting the role of the military orders, particularly the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, in the development of these early strongholds. While their most famous castles would come later, their origins were rooted in protecting pilgrims and securing routes. Their disciplined approach to organization and their growing wealth allowed them to invest heavily in fortifications. Their early hospices and fortified compounds, often near key roads or cities, were precursors to the massive castleries they would eventually command. They brought a particular zeal and a long-term vision to the defense of the kingdom, viewing the construction of strongholds as a sacred duty. Consider the early fortifications of Jerusalem itself. While the city walls were largely pre-existing, the Crusaders immediately set about repairing and strengthening them. They built new towers and gates, adapting the ancient defenses to their own needs. The Tower of David, a formidable citadel, became the heart of the city's defense, a symbol of Crusader power. Its massive stones, weathered by centuries of wind and sun, whispered tales of countless sieges and triumphs. These urban fortifications were just as crucial as the rural castles, protecting the very heart of the kingdom. The early castles were, in essence, an experiment in adaptation. The Crusaders, far from their European homelands, were forced to innovate and learn from the environment and the peoples around them. They were building a new society, stone by stone, in a land that often resisted their presence. Perhaps these walls, rising from the ancient earth, truly did whisper stories to the stars, tales of courage, desperation, and the enduring human desire to find a place to call home, even in the most challenging of circumstances. They were the kingdom's backbone, rigid and unyielding, holding together the fragile dream of a Latin presence in the Holy Land. As the dust of the First Crusade settled, revealing the nascent Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, a new kind of warrior began to emerge from the crucible of faith and conflict, the military orders. These were not merely soldiers, more simply monks, but a unique synthesis of both. Men bound by monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet dedicated to the sword, to the protection of pilgrims, and to the defense of the Holy Land. Among them, two orders would rise to unparalleled prominence, their names becoming synonymous with the very idea of Crusader power and, critically, with the enduring stone behemoths that dotted the landscape, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The origins of the Knights Templar, or the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, are steeped in a blend of piety and pragmatism. Around 1119, a small band of knights, led by Hugh de Paynes, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a radical proposal. They would dedicate themselves to protecting the perilous pilgrim routes leading to the Holy City, a journey fraught with danger from bandits and hostile forces. Initially, they were so poor that they shared a single horse between two men, a poignant image that would later be immortalized in their seal. Their headquarters, granted by Baldwin II, lay within the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, believed by the Crusaders to be the site of Solomon's temple, hence their name. Their formal recognition came at the Council of Troyes in 1129, largely through the fervent advocacy of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the age, who drafted their rule. This rule, a blend of Cistercian monasticism and military discipline, gave them papal sanction and, crucially, independence from local bishops, answerable only to the Pope himself. This unique status, coupled with their reputation for fierce courage and unwavering devotion, soon attracted vast donations of land, money, and recruits from across Europe. Parallel to the Templars, though with a slightly different genesis, were the Knights Hospitaller of St. John of Jerusalem. Their roots were civilian, evolving from an Amalfitan hospital founded in Jerusalem around 1070, even before the First Crusade, dedicated to caring for sick and impoverished pilgrims. After the city's capture, this charitable mission continued under the leadership of Blessed Gerard. However, with the increasing need for armed protection for their patients and the pilgrim routes, the order gradually militarized. By 1120, under Raymond Dupuy, they began to take on military duties, and by the mid-12th century, they were a formidable fighting force, though they never abandoned their original charitable function. They ran extensive hospitals, not just in Jerusalem, but across their vast network of commanderies in Europe, providing medical care that was remarkably advanced for its time. Their white cross on a black background became as iconic as the Templars' red cross on white. Both orders, empowered by papal bulls, immense wealth, and a constant influx of dedicated recruits, became the backbone of the Latin East's defense. They operated as elite shock troops on the battlefield, their disciplined charges often turning the tide of engagements. But their most enduring legacy, perhaps even more than their martial prowess, lies in their unparalleled contribution to military architecture. Unlike feudal lords, who built castles to defend their personal domains, the military orders built for the collective defense of the Latin kingdom, creating a sophisticated, interconnected network of fortifications designed to withstand sustained sieges and project power across vast territories. They were, in essence, the first standing armies of the Crusader states, and their castles were their permanent barracks, training grounds, and strategic strongholds. The Templars, with their vast resources, were particularly prolific builders. Their castles were often characterized by a formidable simplicity, emphasizing sheer strength and defensive capability. One of their earliest and most significant acquisitions was the Castle of Safed in Galilee, a strategically vital point overlooking the Hula Valley. Though the original structure was less impressive, the Templars rebuilt it into a massive, concentric fortress, designed to control the routes leading to Damascus. Its sheer size and the thickness of its walls were legendary, though it eventually fell to Baybars in 1266 after a long and brutal siege. Another prime example of Templar construction was Chastel Pellerin, or Atlit, on the coast south of Acre. Begun in 1218, this was a true masterpiece of Crusader military engineering, a coastal fortress designed to be supplied by sea, making it virtually impregnable from the landward side. It featured massive double walls, a deep moat carved from rock, and formidable towers. Its strategic importance was immense, protecting the coastal road and serving as a vital logistical hub. It was one of the last Crusader strongholds to fall, evacuated by sea in 1291 after the fall of Acre. The Hospitallers, too, were master builders, and their castles often displayed an even greater degree of architectural sophistication, perhaps reflecting their slightly later and more extensive building campaigns. Their most famous castle, indeed, one of the most celebrated castles in the world, is Crac des Chevaliers, or Crac of the Knights. Located in present-day Syria, this colossal fortress was originally a small Kurdish fortification that the Hospitallers acquired in 1142. Over the next century and a half, they transformed it into an astonishing example of concentric castle design, a true marvel of medieval engineering. Crac des Chevaliers stands on a conical hill, its outer walls encompassing an inner fortress, creating two rings of formidable defenses. The outer wall, punctuated by massive round towers, sloped outwards at the base, deflecting siege engine projectiles. Inside, a deep ditch separated the outer and inner wards, which themselves contained a labyrinth of passages, storerooms, and living quarters, capable of housing a garrison of thousands and provisions for years. The sheer scale and complexity of Crac des Chevaliers were breathtaking. Historians still debate the exact cost and labor involved in its construction, but it undoubtedly represented an enormous investment of resources, a testament to the Hospitallers' power and their long-term strategic vision. It famously withstood numerous sieges, including one by Saladin himself in 1188, only falling in 1271 to Baybars, through an elaborate ruse involving a forged letter. Another significant Hospitaller castle was Margat, or Qalat al-Markab, also in Syria. Acquired by the Hospitallers in 1186, Margat was a massive volcanic basalt fortress, its dark stone giving it a particularly brooding and impenetrable appearance. Like Crac, it was a concentric castle, though its layout was adapted to the natural contours of the volcanic cone it occupied. Its enormous keep, or donjon, was one of the largest in the Crusader states, providing a final, formidable refuge. Margat controlled the coastal road and a fertile plain, making it a crucial strategic asset. It too resisted many attacks, finally succumbing to Baybars in 1285. The construction techniques employed by the military orders were advanced for their time. They utilized local materials, often massive ashlar blocks, carefully cut and fitted without mortar in some instances, or with extremely strong lime mortar. Their engineers were adept at understanding angles of fire, defensive lines of sight, and the vulnerabilities of siege warfare. They introduced or perfected features like machicolations, projecting stone galleries with openings for dropping missiles, sally ports, hidden gates for surprise attacks, and complex barbicans, fortified outworks protecting a gate. The sheer scale of these projects suggests a high, godly organized workforce, perhaps even employing local labor alongside skilled European masons. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars of the countless hands that shaped them, of the sweat and grit that went into every perfectly placed stone. The military orders also played a crucial role in maintaining order and administering territories. They were granted vast tracts of land, often sparsely populated, which they were expected to develop and defend. Their castles, therefore, were not just military strongholds, but also administrative centers, agricultural hubs, and places of refuge for the local populace in times of attack. They established a sophisticated system of commanderies, both in the East and in Europe, which served as recruiting grounds, financial centers, and logistical support networks for their operations in the Holy Land. This vast, interconnected system was unique in the medieval world. However, the immense power and wealth of the military orders also led to friction. Their independence from local secular rulers and even bishops sometimes caused resentment. They often acted as states within a state, pursuing their own strategic objectives, which did not always align with those of the King of Jerusalem or other Crusader lords. There were instances of rivalry and even open conflict between the Templars and Hospitallers themselves, particularly over territorial disputes or prestige, which at times weakened the overall Crusader effort. For example, in the mid-13th century, a bitter rivalry between the two orders, fueled by a dispute over control of the city of Acre, erupted into open warfare, further destabilizing the already precarious Latin kingdom. This internal strife was a significant factor in the weakening of Crusader power, a lesser-known detail often overshadowed by the grand narratives of battles against Muslim forces. Despite these internal tensions, the contribution of the military orders to the defense and infrastructure of the Latin East cannot be overstated. Their castles stood as defiant symbols of Crusader presence, physical manifestations of their unwavering commitment to the Holy Land. They were designed not just to defend, but to project an image of impregnable strength, to deter would-be attackers, and to inspire awe. The very sight of Crac des Chevaliers, or Chastel Pèlerin, must have been a daunting prospect for any invading army. The fall of the Crusader states in the late 13th century brought an end to the era of these mighty castles in the Levant. Many were systematically dismantled by the Mamluks to prevent their reoccupation, while others, like Crac des Chevaliers and Margat, were garrisoned by the conquerors. Their formidable defenses turned against any future Christian incursions. The Templars themselves met a tragic end, dissolved by papal decree in 1312 under pressure from King Philip IV of France, who coveted their immense wealth and perhaps feared their power. The Hospitallers, however, continued their existence, moving first to Rhodes and then to Malta, where they continued their military and charitable work, leaving behind another legacy of formidable fortifications. The legacy of the military order's castles endures to this day. They are not merely ruins, they are silent witnesses to an extraordinary period of history, testaments to human ingenuity, faith, and the relentless pursuit of strategic advantage. They represent a pinnacle of medieval military architecture, a sophisticated response to the challenges of defending a distant, often hostile, frontier. Their very stones whisper of the clang of swords, the cries of battle, and the unwavering devotion of the warrior monks who built and defended them, shaping the landscape and the destiny of the Crusader states in ways that continue to fascinate and inspire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and soft violet, the very air along the Levantine coast seemed to hum with a different kind of tension, while the great inland strongholds stood as defiant sentinels over the dusty plains and rocky passes. An equally vital, yet distinct, network of fortifications guarded the very lifeline of the Crusader states, the sea. These were the coastal castles and fortified port cities, the indispensable arteries through which flowed the men, materials, and messages that bound the Latin East to its distant European heart. Their existence was not merely strategic, it was existential. Without them, the entire enterprise would have withered and died, starved of resources and isolated from its origins. The earliest Frankish arrivals, after the initial shock of conquest, quickly understood that holding the interior was one thing, but securing the coast was paramount. Their initial efforts were often pragmatic, reinforcing existing Byzantine or Arab fortifications. Yet as the 12th century progressed and the nature of warfare evolved, so too did the design and purpose of these maritime bulwarks. Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Tripoli. These names became synonymous not just with trade, but with survival. They were the gateways, the points of embarkation and disembarkation, the places where a weary pilgrim might first touch the Holy Land, or where a desperate plea for aid might be launched across the waves. Consider Acre, the true jewel of the coast, often referred to as the key to the kingdom. Its natural harbor, sheltered by the curving bay, made it an irresistible prize. After its capture in 1104 by Baldwin I, aided by a Genoese fleet, its defenses were steadily enhanced. The city itself became a fortress, encircled by concentric walls that grew thicker and taller with each passing decade. The inner wall, known as the Wall of the Pisans, after the Italian merchants who helped fund its construction, was a formidable barrier, punctuated by powerful towers. Beyond it, a second outer wall, often protected by a ditch or moat, provided an additional layer of defense. What made Acre particularly resilient was its integration of land and sea defenses. Chains could be stretched across the harbor mouth to prevent enemy ships from entering, while watchtowers scanned the horizon for approaching fleets. The city's very layout, with its narrow, winding streets and fortified quarters belonging to various military orders and merchant communes, turned every corner into a potential choke point, every building a possible redoubt. The evolution of these coastal defenses was a direct response to the escalating threats. Early on, the primary concern was often land-based assault, but as Muslim naval power grew, particularly under the Fatimids and later the Ayyubids, the focus shifted. Harbors needed protection from direct naval attack, and walls had to be robust enough to withstand bombardment from siege engines mounted on ships or from land-based artillery. The massive breakwaters and moles that extended into the sea, like those at Tyre, were not just for docking ships. They were integral parts of the defensive system, offering platforms for ballistas and catapults to engage enemy vessels. Tyre, another critical port, held out against Saladin even when Jerusalem fell. Its strength lay in its natural position on a peninsula, almost an island, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. This choke point was heavily fortified, making a land assault extremely difficult. Its walls, too, were legendary. Having withstood numerous sieges throughout history, the Crusaders further strengthened them, adding towers and barbicans, creating a truly formidable stronghold. Historians still debate the exact extent of the Crusader modifications to Tyre's ancient Phoenician and Roman foundations. Some argue that the Franks largely rebuilt sections from scratch, while others contend they primarily reinforced and adapted existing structures, a testament to the enduring strategic wisdom of the site. Perhaps the stones themselves, weathered by centuries of salt spray and sun, still hold the echoes of those ancient builders and the Frankish masons who followed. The smaller coastal strongholds, though less grand than Acre or Tyre, were no less vital. Sidon, Beirut, and Tripoli each played their part. Sidon, for instance, boasted a unique sea castle built on a small island, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. This castle, constructed by the Crusaders in the early 13th century, was a perfect example of a specialized coastal defense, designed to control access to the harbor and provide a secure refuge. Its thick walls and strategic placement made it incredibly difficult to assault from either land or sea. Imagine the crashing waves against its ancient stones, the salty spray carried on the wind, a constant reminder of its maritime purpose. The design of these coastal fortifications also reflected a constant interplay between European and local architectural traditions. While the basic principles of concentric defense and flanking towers were imported from the West, the Crusaders often incorporated elements learned from their Byzantine and Arab predecessors, such as the use of glacis to protect the base of walls from undermining, or the precise placement of arrow slits for optimal firing angles. The very stone, often quarried locally, imbued these structures with a sense of belonging to the landscape, even as they stood as symbols of a foreign presence. One lesser-known detail about these coastal defenses is the ingenious use of underwater obstacles. Beyond the visible chains and breakwaters, there is evidence, particularly from archaeological surveys of ancient harbors, that the Crusaders, or earlier civilizations, whose techniques they might have adopted, sometimes deployed submerged barriers. These could include sharpened wooden stakes driven into the seabed, or even large, irregular stone blocks strategically placed to rip open the hulls of approaching enemy ships, forcing them to approach through narrow, predetermined channels where they could be easily targeted by land-based artillery. It's a subtle, almost invisible layer of defense, yet potentially devastating to an unsuspecting fleet. The constant need for maintenance and repair was another defining characteristic of these coastal fortresses. The corrosive effects of salt air, the relentless pounding of waves, and the inevitable wear and tear of sieges meant that a significant portion of the Crusader state's resources had to be continuously poured into their upkeep. This was often funded by the wealthy merchant republics of Italy, Venice, Pisa, and Genoa, who, in exchange for lucrative trading concessions, invested heavily in the defenses of cities like Acre, where their economic interests were deeply intertwined with the city's security. Their distinctive quarters within the city walls, often with their own fortified gates, were mini-fortresses in themselves, reflecting the fragmented yet interdependent nature of Crusader society. The fall of these coastal strongholds marked the beginning of the end for the Crusader states. When Saladin captured most of the inland castles after the Battle of Hattin in 1187, the remaining Crusader presence clung precariously to the coast. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, managed to recapture Acre, which then became the de facto capital of the truncated kingdom for over a century. But the pressure never truly relented. The Mamluks, rising to power in Egypt, understood that to truly extinguish the Crusader presence, they had to sever the lifeline to Europe. The sieges of these coastal cities were epic struggles, often lasting for months, involving massive armies and sophisticated siege engines. The Siege of Acre in 1291, for example, was one of the largest and most brutal sieges of the Diasley. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil brought an overwhelming force, including hundreds of siege machines, to bear against the city's formidable defenses. Despite the heroic resistance of the defenders, including the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, the walls were eventually breached. The fall of Acre was not just the loss of a city, it was the loss of the last major Crusader foothold in the Levant. The enduring legacy of these coastal castles lies not just in their ruins, but in the stories they tell of adaptability, resilience, and the relentless struggle for survival. They were more than just stone and mortar. They were the anchors of an entire civilization, the places where East met West, where trade flourished alongside conflict, and where the dream of a Latin kingdom in the Holy Land was nurtured and defended for nearly 2 centuries. As the waves continue to lap against their foundations, perhaps they whisper tales of galleys arriving with fresh crusaders, of merchants haggling in crowded souks, and of watchmen scanning the endless blue for signs of friend or foe, forever guarding the fragile connection across the sea. As the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem began to solidify its hold on the Levant, the focus shifted from the initial conquest to the arduous task of defense. The western coast, with its bustling port cities like Acre and Tyre, remained vital for communication and resupply. But it was the eastern frontier that truly tested the Crusaders' ingenuity and resilience. Here, facing the vast, often hostile interior, rose a new breed of fortress, designed not merely to hold ground, but to project power, deter invasion, and serve as a bulwark against the inevitable Muslim counteroffensives. These were the castles of the Eastern Marches, stark sentinels against a shifting tide. The landscape itself dictated much of their design. Unlike the coastal plains, the East was characterized by rugged hills, deep wadis, and arid plateaus, often sparsely populated. Castles here were not just military outposts. They were self-contained communities, often isolated for months on end. Their garrisons a mix of Frankish knights, local Christian levies, and even some converted Muslims. The challenges were immense: securing water, provisioning food, maintaining morale, and above all, enduring the constant threat of siege. One of the most formidable examples of these eastern strongholds was Kerak, perched dramatically atop a triangular plateau in Transjordan, dominating the ancient King's Highway. Its strategic importance was undeniable, controlling trade routes and pilgrim paths alike. Built by Pagan the Butler, the Lord of Ultre-Jourdain in the 1140s, Kerak was a testament to the evolving understanding of military architecture. Unlike earlier, simpler keeps, Kerak was a sprawling complex, its defenses layered. A massive outer wall, punctuated by numerous towers, encircled the entire plateau, protecting the town that huddled within. Inside, a formidable inner citadel, with its own independent defenses, provided a final refuge. The sheer scale of Kerak, with its deep ditches carved into the living rock, its subterranean passages, and its commanding views across the Dead Sea Valley, spoke volumes of the perceived threat from the east. Life within these remote garrisons was harsh. The knights and sergeants stationed at Kerak, Montreal, or Safed lived a Spartan existence, their days punctuated by drills, patrols, and the ever-present watch. Water, often collected in vast cisterns, was a precious commodity, carefully rationed. Food supplies, brought in from distant fertile lands or cultivated in small protected plots nearby, were vulnerable to raids. The isolation could be profound, broken only by the arrival of a supply caravan or the distant dust cloud signaling an approaching army. Perhaps these walls whispered stories of longing and resilience to the stars, as the lonely sentinels gazed out into the vast, silent wilderness. Another pivotal eastern fortress was the Castle of Safed in Galilee. Its history is a fascinating blend of strategic necessity and architectural ambition. Initially a smaller Crusader fortification, it was rebuilt and massively expanded by the Knights Templar in the 1240s, becoming one of the largest and most expensive fortresses ever constructed by the Crusaders. The Templars, with their vast resources and military expertise, poured immense effort into Safed, recognizing its critical position guarding the approaches to Acre and the fertile plains of Galilee from potential attacks originating from Damascus or the Jordan Valley. Safed's design showcased the pinnacle of Crusader defensive architecture. It was a concentric castle, meaning it had multiple rings of walls, one inside the other, each providing an independent line of defense. The outer wall, with its numerous projecting towers, was designed to absorb the initial shock of an attack. Should it be breached, the attackers would then face a second, higher wall, equally fortified, creating a killing ground between the two. The inner citadel, standing proudly at the heart, was the strongest point, a final redoubt. This multi-layered approach was a direct response to the increasing sophistication of siege warfare, particularly the use of powerful trebuchets and sapping techniques. The Templars even incorporated a massive deep ditch, often dry, but capable of being flooded, further complicating any assault. However, despite their formidable appearance, these eastern castles faced unique vulnerabilities. Manpower was a constant issue. Maintaining a full garrison in such remote locations was a drain on the kingdom's limited resources. The garrisons, though brave, were often stretched thin. Furthermore, the very isolation that made them strategic also made them susceptible to prolonged sieges, where starvation and disease could prove as deadly as any enemy assault. The fall of Karak in 1188 to Saladin's forces, after an 8-month siege, highlighted this vulnerability. Despite its strength, the castle eventually succumbed to a combination of relentless pressure and the sheer exhaustion of its defenders. Historians still disagree on the exact motivations behind the Templars' colossal investment in Safed. Was it purely strategic, a logical strongpoint against Mamluk incursions? Or was there an element of overconfidence, a belief that sheer impregnability could compensate for dwindling resources and political fragmentation within the Crusader states? The castle's ultimate fate, falling to the Mamluk Sultan Baibars in 1266 after a brutal siege, suggests that even the most advanced fortifications could not withstand overwhelming force and internal weakness. Baibars, known for his ruthlessness and military prowess, employed massive siege engines and relentless assaults, eventually forcing the Templar garrison to surrender under terms that were then brutally violated, with many of the defenders massacred. Beyond the grand fortresses like Karak and Safed, the eastern frontier was dotted with smaller but equally vital outposts. Castles like Belvoir, built by the Hospitallers in the 1160s, overlooked the Jordan Valley, controlling access to the Sea of Galilee and the fertile plains beyond. Belvoir, with its symmetrical, concentric design, was a masterpiece of military engineering, often cited as one of the finest examples of Crusader castle architecture. Its regular plan, with its massive corner towers and deep moat, represented a mature understanding of defensive principles, designed to maximize interlocking fields of fire and minimize blind spots. The castle's unique feature was its inner courtyard, which was raised above the level of the outer ward, allowing defenders on the inner walls to fire over the heads of those on the outer wall, creating a truly layered defense. The construction of these castles was an immense undertaking, requiring vast resources, skilled masons, and a huge labor force. Stone was quarried locally, often from the very rock on which the castle stood, but timber, iron, and other specialized materials had to be transported over long distances, often at great risk. The logistical challenges alone were staggering, reflecting the Crusaders' deep commitment to securing their precarious foothold in the Holy Land. The sheer physical effort involved in shaping and lifting the massive stones, often without the aid of sophisticated machinery, speaks to the determination and perhaps even desperation of the builders. Yet even with these impressive defenses, the Crusaders faced a persistent strategic dilemma. Their castles, while formidable, were largely static. They could hold ground, but they struggled to project power far into enemy territory. Muslim forces, particularly the agile cavalry units, could often bypass these strongpoints, raiding undefended villages or striking at supply lines. The castles became islands of Frankish control in a sea of often hostile territory, their garrisons effectively tied down, unable to launch large-scale offensive operations. The lesser-known castle of Kas, Tel Nuf or Kalat Hunin, located in the hills of Upper Galilee, offers another glimpse into the complexities of the eastern frontier. While not as grand as Karak or Safed, it played a crucial role in guarding a key pass leading from Tyre towards Damascus. Its history is somewhat obscure, but it was held by the Crusader lords of Tehran and frequently changed hands between Christian and Muslim control, underscoring the fluidity of the borderlands. Its repeated capture and recapture highlight the constant skirmishes and shifting allegiances that characterized life in these contested zones. The very obscurity of Chastelneuf, compared to its more famous brethren, speaks to the multitude of smaller yet vital strongholds that formed the vast network of Crusader defenses. The scholarly dispute regarding the ideal Crusader castle design often revolves around the debate between the earlier, more organic, often irregular castles like Kerak, which adapted to their natural topography, and the later, more symmetrical, concentric designs exemplified by Belvoir and Safed. Some historians argue that the concentric plan represented a significant leap forward in defensive thinking, offering maximum protection with minimum manpower. Others contend that the earlier, irregular castles, by exploiting natural features, were equally effective and often more cost-efficient to build, particularly in difficult terrain. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with both approaches proving effective depending on the specific site, available resources, and the nature of the threat. The evolution of castle design was a dynamic process, a constant adaptation to changing military technologies and strategic realities. As the 13th century wore on, the eastern frontier became increasingly volatile. The rise of the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, a powerful and unified force, brought unprecedented pressure to bear on the Crusader states. Sultan Baybars, in particular, pursued a systematic campaign to dismantle the Crusader strongholds, often targeting them one by one, using overwhelming force and sophisticated siege techniques. He understood that without their castles, the Franks could not hold the land. The fall of Beaufort Castle in 1268, another crucial eastern stronghold overlooking the Litani River, was a stark reminder of the changing tide. After a prolonged siege, the castle, though heavily fortified, eventually succumbed. Baybars, in a display of strategic brilliance, often offered generous terms of surrender, only to renege on them once the garrisons had evacuated, thereby discouraging future resistance. This psychological warfare, combined with his military might, proved devastating to the morale of the Crusader defenders. The challenges of remote garrisons extended beyond military threats. Maintaining discipline and morale in isolated outposts, far from the comforts of the coastal cities, was a constant struggle. Disease, often rampant in medieval conditions, could decimate a garrison as effectively as any siege engine. The sheer monotony of life, broken only by the occasional skirmish or the arrival of a new commander, could lead to despair. Yet, these garrisons, often numbering only a few dozen knights and their retinues, held their ground for decades, a testament to their faith, their training, and their unwavering, if sometimes desperate, commitment to the Crusader cause. The story of the eastern frontier castles is one of immense effort, strategic foresight, and ultimately tragic decline. They were built to last, monuments to an ambition that stretched across continents, but they could not indefinitely withstand the relentless pressure of a unified and determined enemy. As the 13th century drew to a close, one by one, these mighty fortresses, which had once seemed impregnable, fell silent, their walls echoing with the ghosts of battles long past, their stones bearing witness to the ebb and flow of empires. Their ruins, scattered across rugged landscapes of Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon, stand today as poignant reminders of a grand, yet ultimately doomed endeavor to hold a distant land. They are not just piles of stones, but narratives etched in rock, telling tales of courage, isolation, and the enduring human struggle against overwhelming odds. The very stones of the Crusader castles, once thought impregnable, began to whisper tales of vulnerability as the tide of war turned. The initial fervor and strategic brilliance that had forged these strongholds now faced a relentless, evolving challenge. The Mamluks, heirs to Saladin's legacy, refined siege warfare into a devastating art form, forcing the Franks to confront the painful lessons of their own architectural shortcomings. Each fallen castle became a grim textbook, its shattered walls outlining new principles of defense. One of the earliest and most brutal lessons came with the siege of Safed in 1266. This formidable hospitaller castle, perched high on a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee, was a marvel of concentric defense, boasting 2 massive curtain walls and a deep moat. Yet Sultan Baybars, a military genius of the age, brought to bear an unprecedented array of siege engines, including enormous trebuchets capable of hurling immense stones. For weeks, the Mamluks battered Safed, their relentless assault chipping away at the outer defenses. What truly broke the spirit of the defenders, however, was not just the physical destruction, but the psychological warfare waged by Baybars. He undermined sections of the walls, causing them to collapse with terrifying suddenness, and employed sappers to dig beneath the foundations. The sheer scale and intensity of the Mamluk attack, coupled with the realization that even the thickest walls could be breached, led to a desperate parley. The garrison, promised safe passage, surrendered, only to be massacred by Baybars, a chilling betrayal that echoed through the remaining Crusader strongholds. The fall of Safed sent shockwaves through the Latin East, compelling a reevaluation of existing defenses. It highlighted the vulnerability of even the most robust stone walls to sustained battering, and more critically, to the art of mining. Sappers, digging tunnels beneath the foundations and then collapsing them by setting fires within, proved to be an insidious and highly effective weapon. This realization spurred immediate adaptations. Existing castles were retrofitted with countermines, tunnels dug by the defenders parallel to the walls, allowing them to intercept and collapse enemy mining operations. These countermines often had listening posts where defenders would press their ears to the ground, straining to hear the faint pickaxes of the enemy below. Some castles, like the later additions to Acre's defenses, incorporated deeper foundations, sometimes even bedrock, to make undermining more difficult. The sieges also underscored the importance of supply lines and water sources. A castle might be structurally sound, but if its garrison starved or thirsted, its fate was sealed. Crac de Chevaliers, for instance, had an elaborate system of cisterns and a large internal courtyard that could sustain a significant garrison for extended periods. However, other castles were less fortunate. The siege of Montfort in 1271, a Teutonic knight's stronghold, saw Baybars target its external water supply, forcing the defenders to rely solely on internal cisterns. While Montfort eventually fell due to a combination of mining and intense bombardment, the lesson about water security was clear. Later castle designs, or modifications to existing ones, often prioritized secure internal water sources, sometimes even digging wells within the innermost keep. Perhaps the most enduring architectural legacy of these brutal sieges was the evolution of the keep, or donjon. Initially, the keep was often a tall, prominent tower, a last refuge. However, its height made it a prime target for Mamluk siege engines, and its isolated nature could make resupply or reinforcement difficult once the outer walls were breached. The lessons of sieges like Safed and Montfort led to a shift towards more squat, massive keeps, often integrated more seamlessly into the overall defensive circuit, rather than standing as a separate, vulnerable entity. These newer keeps were designed to withstand direct bombardment and could serve as a command center and a final bastion, but their lower profile made them harder to target and less prone to collapse. The emphasis moved from height as a symbol of power to sheer mass and defensive resilience. The experience of the Siege of Antioch in 1268, another Mamluk triumph under Baibars, provided a stark reminder of the perils of extensive, thinly defended walls. Antioch, a vast city with an enormous perimeter, had walls stretching for miles, making it impossible to man every section effectively. Baibars exploited this weakness, launching a concentrated assault on a single, less defended gate. Once breached, the city fell swiftly. This event reinforced the Crusader understanding that smaller, more concentrated, and therefore more defensible strongholds were preferable to sprawling, vulnerable cities. While cities like Acre remained vital ports, their defenses were increasingly focused on compact, heavily fortified sectors rather than attempting to protect the entire sprawling urban area. The very nature of the Mamluk army also influenced castle design. Unlike earlier Arab forces, the Mamluks brought not only sophisticated siege engines, but also vast numbers of skilled engineers and sappers. Their proficiency in undermining walls was unparalleled. This forced Crusader architects to think not just about outward defenses, but about inward resistance. The development of concentric castles with multiple layers of walls, each designed to be independently defensible, was partly a response to this. If the outer wall fell, the inner wall still presented a formidable obstacle, buying time and allowing defenders to retreat and regroup. The space between the walls, known as the death zone, became an even more lethal killing ground, where archers and crossbowmen could rain down projectiles on enemy forces trapped between the two lines of defense. The Siege of Tripoli in 1289, though ultimately a Mamluk victory, demonstrated the growing sophistication of Crusader counter-siege tactics. The city, protected by a strong citadel and a series of towers, held out for weeks against Sultan Qalawun's forces. The defenders employed Greek fire, a devastating incendiary weapon, and launched frequent sorties to disrupt Mamluk siege preparations. While Tripoli eventually succumbed, the prolonged resistance showcased how the Franks had learned to combine passive defenses with active harassment of the besiegers. This included not only sorties, but also the use of catapults and ballistas from within the castle to target enemy siege engines and concentrations of troops. However, historians still disagree whether the ultimate failure of the Crusader castles was primarily due to architectural limitations or a fundamental shift in the balance of power and resources. Was it simply that the Mamluks, with their vast manpower and superior siege technology, could overwhelm any fortification, regardless of its design? Or did the Franks, despite their innovations, fail to adapt quickly enough or comprehensively enough to the evolving threats? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The Crusader states were, by the late 13th century, isolated and increasingly starved of reinforcements and funds from Europe. Even the most perfectly designed castle could not hold out indefinitely against an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority and an inexhaustible supply of resources. The fall of Acre in 1291, the final bastion of the Crusader kingdom, epitomized all the lessons and failures. Acre's defenses were extensive, incorporating many of the innovations learned from earlier sieges: multiple concentric walls, strong towers, and a well-defended port. Yet Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil brought an army of unprecedented size, estimated to be over 100,000 men, along with a vast array of siege engines. The Mamluks systematically pounded Acre's walls. Focused using their efforts on specific sectors, they deployed sappers with devastating effect, collapsing entire sections of the walls. The sheer weight of numbers and the relentless coordinated assault proved too much. Despite heroic resistance, including a desperate counterattack by the Templars, the city fell, marking the end of the Crusader presence in the Levant. The legacy of these sieges, beyond the immediate destruction, was a profound transformation in military architecture. The castles that rose in Europe in the wake of the Crusades, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, bore the indelible marks of these experiences. The tall, vulnerable keeps of earlier eras gave way to more compact, heavily defended gatehouses and integrated keeps. Walls became thicker, often incorporating sloping bases, talus, to deflect projectiles and make undermining more difficult. The emphasis shifted from sheer height to defensive depth and redundancy. The development of machicolations, projecting structures from which defenders could drop stones or boiling liquids onto attackers at the base of the walls, became more widespread, a direct response to the close-quarters combat that often ensued during breaches. Perhaps these walls, even in their ruin, still whisper stories to the stars, not just of valiant defense and brutal assault, but of human ingenuity and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. They speak of the relentless cycle of innovation in warfare, where every new weapon demands a new defense, and every successful siege writes a new chapter in the art of fortification. The Crusader castles, born of ambition and faith, were ultimately refined and transformed by the very forces that sought to destroy them, leaving behind a legacy of architectural adaptation that shaped military engineering for centuries to come. They stand as silent monuments to an era when stone and strategy clashed in a desperate struggle for control, forever etched with the lessons learned from both devastating defeats and the fleeting triumphs of defense. The air, once thick with the dust of construction and the shouts of masons, now carried the distant murmur of a new, formidable power rising in the east. For decades, the Frankish strongholds had stood as defiant bastions, their stone walls a testament to a faith fiercely defended. Yet the political landscape was shifting beneath their very foundations. A unified force was gathering, not fragmented like the emirates and caliphates of old, but coalescing under the banner of a single brilliant leader, Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. His ascent was swift and strategic. From his beginnings as a Kurdish general in the service of the Zengids, Saladin had, by 1174, consolidated control over Egypt and much of Syria, effectively encircling the Crusader states. His vision was clear: to reclaim Jerusalem for Islam and to expel the Frankish presence from the Holy Land. This was not merely a military campaign, but a spiritual crusade of his own, imbued with a profound sense of destiny. The castles, once symbols of Frankish dominance, now found themselves on the defensive, their garrisons often isolated and stretched thin. The first major blow came not to a castle, but to the Crusader army itself, at the Horns of Hattin in July 1187. This catastrophic defeat, a mere day's march from the Sea of Galilee, saw the virtual annihilation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's fighting force. The true cross, a revered relic carried into battle, was captured, and King Guy of Lusignan himself was taken prisoner. The psychological impact of Hattin was immense. signaling the beginning of the end for many Crusader strongholds. In the immediate aftermath of Hattin, Saladin moved with breathtaking speed. The path to Jerusalem lay open, but before he laid siege to the Holy City, he systematically targeted the castles and towns that protected its approaches and flanks. Tiberias, Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, one after another, these vital ports and fortified cities fell. The defenders, often demoralized by the news from Hattin and lacking relief, frequently negotiated terms of surrender, choosing to evacuate rather than face a prolonged siege and certain destruction. The castles themselves presented varying challenges. Some, like the formidable Crac de Chevaliers, were too strong and well garrisoned to be taken quickly, and Saladin, focused on Jerusalem, often bypassed them, knowing their strategic value diminished once the heart of the kingdom was seized. Others, however, were vital to his logistical lines or posed immediate threats. Ascalon, a powerful coastal fortress south of Jaffa, was besieged and taken in September 1187, its fall further isolating Jerusalem. The greatest prize. Jerusalem itself fell on October 2, 1187, after a relatively short siege. The city's defenses, though strong, were manned by a populace largely made up of non-combatants and a small, desperate garrison. Unlike the brutal sack of 1099, Saladin's entry was marked by a remarkable degree of restraint and mercy. He allowed Christians to leave, often for a ransom, and protected their holy sites, a stark contrast to the earlier Frankish conquest. The Dome of the Rock, which had been converted into a church, was restored as a mosque, its golden dome once again reflecting the sun as a symbol of Islamic resurgence. With Jerusalem in his hands, Saladin's attention turned to securing his gains. Many castles, particularly those in the interior and along the coast, now found themselves deep within Ayyubid territory. Some were dismantled by Saladin to prevent their reuse by the Franks. Their stones repurposed for his own fortifications or simply left as rubble. Others were garrisoned by his own forces, becoming part of the new Ayyubid defensive network. The fall of so many strongholds sent shockwaves across Europe, sparking the Third Crusade. This massive undertaking, led by the most powerful monarchs of the age, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, aimed to reclaim Jerusalem and reverse Saladin's conquests. Their arrival in the Holy Land in the early 1190s initiated a new phase of intense campaigning, much of which revolved around the capture and recapture of castles. Acre, a crucial port city and gateway to the Holy Land, became the focal point of the Third Crusade. Besieged by the Crusaders for 2 long years, 1189 to 1191, its fortifications, though damaged, held out valiantly under Saladin's indirect support. The Siege of Acre was one of the longest and bloodiest of the Crusades, a testament to the enduring strength of well-defended walls. Its eventual fall to the combined might of the Crusader armies was a major victory, providing them with a vital base of operations. Richard the Lionheart, a military genius and formidable warrior, played a pivotal role in the subsequent campaigns. He understood the strategic importance of castles and fortified positions. After Acre, his forces marched south along the coast, rebuilding and refortifying key locations as they went. The walls of Jaffa, which Saladin had largely dismantled after its capture, were painstakingly reconstructed by Richard's engineers. This was a common pattern. Castles that had been reduced to rubble by one side were often rebuilt by the other, a cyclical process of destruction and reconstruction that speaks to the enduring value of these strongholds. The period after Saladin's initial conquests saw a concerted effort by the remaining Crusader states, primarily based in Acre, to rebuild and refortify their positions. The military orders, particularly the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, whose grand castles like Crac de Chevaliers and Marcab had largely withstood Saladin's onslaught, became even more crucial. They poured resources into strengthening their existing fortresses and constructing new, formidable defenses where possible. Consider the castle of Safed in Galilee. This strategic hilltop fortress, initially built by the Templars, had fallen to Saladin in 1188. After the Third Crusade, it remained in Ayyubid hands, but its importance was not forgotten. Later, under the Mamluks, it would be further strengthened, illustrating the continuous strategic value of these sites across different ruling powers. Historians still debate the exact extent of Saladin's demolition efforts on specific castles. While it's clear he razed many less significant ones, the sheer scale of the task and the speed of his campaigns suggests that some fortifications were merely abandoned or lightly damaged rather than systematically destroyed, leaving them ripe for reoccupation and repair by the Franks. The coastal strip, from Tyre in the north to Ascalon in the south, became the heartland of the revived Crusader kingdom. Castles like Caesarea and Arsuf, which had fallen to Saladin, were reoccupied and their defenses painstakingly repaired. The focus was on creating a strong, defensible line along the coast, protecting the vital sea lanes that connected them to Europe. The logistics of these rebuilding efforts were immense. Stone had to be quarried and transported, often over difficult terrain. Skilled masons, carpenters, and laborers were needed in large numbers. Funding, often from European donations and monastic orders, was crucial. The castles that emerged from this period of reconstruction were often even more sophisticated than their predecessors, incorporating lessons learned from sieges and new architectural innovations. Concentric defenses, with multiple layers of walls and towers, became more common, designed to absorb and dissipate the force of an attacking army. The Teutonic Knights, a German military order that rose to prominence during the Third Crusade, also played a significant role in castle building and defense. Their fortress at Montfort in Galilee, though built later, exemplifies the sophisticated engineering and strategic placement characteristic of the Crusader castles. It was designed to control a vital valley route and protect the Crusader heartland. Perhaps these walls, scarred by siege and rebuilt with such determination, whispered stories of the shifting tides of power, of the fierce loyalty of their garrisons, and the endless cycle of conflict. They stood as silent witnesses to the ebb and flow of empires, enduring monuments to human ambition and resilience. The shadow of Saladin had indeed fallen over the Frankish strongholds, but it had also spurred a new era of fortification, a desperate yet ultimately successful effort to cling to a foothold in the Holy Land, even as the dream of a vast, unified Latin kingdom began to recede into history. The castles, battered but unbowed, remained the enduring symbols of this struggle, their stones echoing the clash of cultures and the enduring human desire to build, to defend, and to hold ground against all odds. The vibrant tapestry of the Crusader states, woven with threads of fervent belief and iron will, began to fray under the relentless pressure from the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks, a formidable military class that had seized power in Egypt, viewed the Frankish presence as an intolerable affront, a lingering wound on the body of the Islamic world. Their campaigns were not merely punitive raids, but a systematic, calculated effort to dismantle every vestige of Crusader power, brick by painstaking brick. This final, devastating chapter in the history of Crusader castles was marked by a chilling efficiency and a strategic brilliance that the Franks, despite their renowned fortifications, found themselves increasingly unable to counter. The Mamluk strategy was clear: isolate, besiege, and destroy. They understood that the castles, once symbols of impregnable strength, were also anchors, tying Crusader forces to fixed points and limiting their mobility. By removing these anchors, they could effectively sever the Frankish hold on the Levant. One of the earliest and most significant blows came in 1265 with the fall of Arsuf. Sultan Baybars, a name that would echo with dread through Crusader lands, personally directed the siege. He employed massive siege engines, including trebuchets capable of hurling immense stones, and sappers who tunneled beneath the walls, undermining their foundations. The Knights Hospitaller, who defended Arsuf, fought with their customary ferocity, but the Mamluk assault was overwhelming. After a prolonged siege, the castle fell. Baybars, in a chilling demonstration of his intent, ordered the castle systematically dismantled. Its formidable walls, which had once stood defiant against countless attacks, were reduced to rubble, a stark message to any who dared to resist. This was not merely about conquest, it was about eradication. The destruction of Arsuf was a prelude to a larger, more ambitious campaign. Baybars, a master strategist, understood the psychological impact of his actions. He moved swiftly, striking at one Crusader stronghold after another, never allowing his enemies time to regroup or reinforce. Caesarea, another significant coastal fortress, fell shortly after Arsuf. Again, the pattern was repeated: overwhelming force, relentless siege, and then the systematic demolition of the fortifications. The Mamluks were not interested in occupying these castles. They were interested in ensuring they could never again serve as bases for Frankish power. This policy of deliberate destruction was a departure from earlier sieges, where castles might be captured and garrisoned. The Mamluks, however, aimed for a final solution: a complete cleansing of the Crusader presence. The year 1268 brought an even more devastating blow: the fall of Antioch. This ancient city, once the jewel of the Crusader states and the seat of a powerful principality, had stood for over 170 years. Its formidable walls and strategic location had long made it seem invincible. Yet, Baybars, with a massive army, laid siege. The Mamluks employed a combination of direct assault and psychological warfare, spreading terror and despair among the defenders. When Antioch finally fell, the ensuing massacre was horrific, intended to break the will of any remaining Crusader strongholds. The city was plundered, its churches desecrated, and its population either slaughtered or enslaved. The fortifications, like those of Arsuf and Caesarea, were systematically dismantled, leaving behind a desolate ruin. The loss of Antioch sent shockwaves through Europe, a stark realization that the tide had irrevocably turned. Historians still debate the exact reasons for the Mamluk sustained success where earlier Muslim armies had faltered. Some point to their highly centralized military command, their mastery of siege warfare, and their unwavering determination. Others emphasize the internal divisions and dwindling resources of the Crusader states, which were increasingly isolated from European support. Perhaps it was a combination of these factors, a perfect storm that gathered over the beleaguered Frankish enclaves. The Mamluks, unlike their predecessors, also employed a policy of scorched earth, systematically destroying agricultural lands and infrastructure around Crusader strongholds, further weakening their ability to sustain themselves. The relentless Mamluk campaigns continued into the 1270s and 1280s under Baybars's successors, particularly Sultan Kalawan. He continued the policy of systematic destruction, focusing on the remaining Crusader strongholds along the coast. One of the most significant of these was the formidable fortress of Margit, held by the Knights Hospitaller. Margit was a truly impressive castle, a sprawling complex of concentric walls, massive towers, and deep moats perched atop a volcanic cone. It was considered one of the strongest Crusader castles, a testament to the ingenuity of Frankish military architecture. In 1285, Kalawan laid siege to Margit. The Mamluks, recognizing the immense strength of its defenses, focused on undermining the walls. They dug tunnels beneath the foundations, shoring them up with timber, and then setting the timber alight, causing sections of the wall to collapse. This technique, though ancient, was incredibly effective against even the most robust fortifications. After a month-long siege, the Hospitallers, facing imminent collapse of their walls, negotiated a surrender. Kalawan, unlike Baybars, allowed the garrison to depart safely. But the castle itself was partially dismantled, its outer defenses razed to prevent its future use by the Crusaders. A Mamluk garrison was then placed within its remaining structures, a stark symbol of their triumph. The fall of Margit was a severe blow, but the Crusaders' last great bastion remained: Acre. Acre, the capital of the diminished kingdom of Jerusalem, was a bustling port city, heavily fortified, and teeming with a diverse population of Franks, Italians, and Eastern Christians. It was the last significant foothold of Crusader power in the Levant, a vibrant, if increasingly precarious, hub of trade and diplomacy. Its defenses were formidable: a double ring of walls, numerous towers, and a deep moat bolstered by the presence of the military orders and the forces of various European powers. The final act in this historical drama unfolded in 1291. Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil, Kalawan's son, amassed an enormous army, perhaps as many as 100,000 men, and an unprecedented array of siege engines, including some of the largest trebuchets ever seen. The Siege of Acre was a monumental undertaking, a clash of civilizations on a grand scale. For weeks, the Mamluks pounded the city's walls with relentless bombardment. Sappers worked tirelessly to undermine the towers, while Mamluk engineers constructed massive siege towers to assault the ramparts. The defenders of Acre, though outnumbered, fought with desperate courage. The Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, alongside contingents from Venice, Genoa, and Cyprus, launched furious counterattacks. But the Mamluk pressure was unyielding. The sheer scale of the Mamluk assault was overwhelming. One particular detail that often goes unnoticed is the Mamluks' use of a specialized unit known as the miners or sappers, who were expert in excavating tunnels beneath the walls. They would then support these tunnels with wooden props and set them ablaze, causing the ground above to collapse, bringing down sections of the fortifications. This highly effective, though dangerous, technique was crucial in breaking through Acre's defenses. On May 18, 1291, after a siege of over a month, the Mamluks finally breached Acre's inner walls. What followed was a brutal street-by-street battle, as the remaining defenders fought to the last. Many, including the Grand Master of the Templars, William of Beaujeu, fell in the fighting. Those who could fled by sea, leaving behind a city in ruins. The fall of Acre was not just the loss of a city, it was the end of the Crusader states in the Levant. The Mamluks, true to their policy, systematically dismantled Acre's fortifications, ensuring that it could never again serve as a Crusader base. The great walls and towers that had stood for generations were torn down, their stones scattered, their very memory erased from the landscape. The strategic implications of Acre's fall were immense. With their last major stronghold gone, the remaining Crusader garrisons along the coast quickly capitulated or were evacuated. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and other smaller outposts were abandoned or captured in the months that followed. The castles, once symbols of enduring power, became silent witnesses to the Mamluk triumph. Some, like the formidable Templar fortress of Atlit, were abandoned and then systematically demolished by the Mamluks to prevent any future reoccupation. Others, like the hospitaller castle of Chastel Pellerin, Atlit, were simply left to crumble, their purpose extinguished. The Mamluk campaigns of the late 13th century represent a pivotal moment in military history. They demonstrated the effectiveness of a highly organized, professional army employing advanced siege techniques against even the most formidable fortifications. The systematic destruction of the castles was not an act of wanton destruction, but a calculated, strategic imperative. It was a clear message that the Mamluks intended to leave no stone unturned, no wall standing, that could facilitate a return of the Franks. Perhaps the wind, whispering through the shattered remains of these once mighty fortresses, carried the echoes of both their builders' fervent hopes and their ultimate tragic demise. The landscape, once dotted with the proud silhouettes of Crusader castles, was now largely barren of their presence. A testament to the Mamluks' relentless and ultimately successful campaign to reclaim the Holy Land. The dream of a permanent Frankish presence in the East had finally, irrevocably, faded. The stone sentinels, once vibrant with the clatter of arms and the murmur of Latin prayers, began their slow descent into silence. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the definitive end of the Crusader states in the Levant, and with it, the purpose of many of these formidable fortresses. Those castles that remained in Frankish hands after earlier defeats, like the formidable Crac de Chevaliers, had already succumbed to Mamluk sieges in the 1270s. Their garrisons either put to the sword or allowed to depart under terms. The Mamluks, under sultans like Baybars and Kalawoon, understood the strategic importance of these structures. Rather than simply destroying them, they often adapted them for their own use, or systematically dismantled them to prevent any future Crusader resurgence. Consider the fate of Safed Castle, perched high in the Galilee. After its capture by Baybars in 1266, its massive walls, once a symbol of Templar might, were partially razed and its stones repurposed for Mamluk fortifications elsewhere. The intricate engineering, the deep moats, and the multiple layers of defense that had taken decades to construct were undone with a methodical efficiency. This was not always an act of pure destruction. It was a strategic calculation. The Mamluks, having expelled the Crusaders, sought to secure their borders against any potential return, and denying them ready-made strongholds was paramount. Yet some castles, particularly those in less strategic or more remote locations, were simply abandoned. Their wooden roofs rotted away, their iron gates rusted, and their carefully carved stones began to crumble under the relentless sun and seasonal rains. Nature, with its patient persistence, began to reclaim what human hands had so painstakingly built. Vines crept up the battlements, and dust settled in the echoing halls where knights once feasted. The wind, whistling through broken archways, became the only sound in chambers that once resonated with commands and the clang of steel. Over the centuries that followed, as the Mamluk Sultanate gave way to the Ottoman Empire in the early 16th century, the role of these castles continued to evolve. Some, like the citadel in Damascus, which had Crusader-era elements integrated into its structure, continued to serve as military strongholds or administrative centers under the Ottomans. Others, particularly those in the interior, far from the coast or major trade routes, became sources of building material for local villages. It was not uncommon for villagers to quarry the well-dressed stones from a nearby ruin to construct their homes, mosques, or even agricultural terraces. This process of spoliation, though destructive to the historical fabric of the castles, speaks to a different kind of legacy, their practical utility long after their original purpose had faded. The Castle of Montfort, nestled in the Upper Galilee, offers a poignant example of this gradual decay and transformation. After its fall in 1271 to Baybars, it was largely left to ruin. Its remote location protected it from extensive Mamluk reuse, but also condemned it to slow disintegration. Today, its dramatic silhouette against the sky, with its crumbling walls and overgrown courtyards, evokes a sense of romantic desolation. It whispers of a time when the Teutonic Knights, who had made it their headquarters, looked out from its towers towards the distant sea, dreaming of a lasting presence in the Holy Land. Historians still debate the exact extent of the damage inflicted by Baybars' siege engineers versus the slow erosion of time and the elements. Some argue that the Mamluks systematically undermined key structural points, while others suggest that the castle's inherent vulnerability to siege engines, combined with its exposed position, led to its rapid collapse and subsequent abandonment. The legacy of the Crusader Castles is not merely one of ruin and decay. However, they stand as enduring testaments to a remarkable period of military architecture and cross-cultural exchange. The very techniques employed in their construction, the innovative use of concentric defenses, machicolations, and glacis, influenced later European castle design. Knights returning from the Levant brought back not only tales of their campaigns, but also practical knowledge of fortification. The castles, in their design and execution, reflect a synthesis of Western European military traditions with local Byzantine and Islamic architectural practices. For instance, the use of large, finely dressed ashlar blocks, often seen in Crusader construction, echoes the Roman and Byzantine building techniques that were still visible in the region. Consider the Castle of Saladin Sea Castle, built by the Crusaders in the 13th century on a small island, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. Though partially destroyed and rebuilt over centuries, its surviving elements, like the two towers connected by a wall, speak to the ingenuity of its builders. Its transformation under Mamluk and Ottoman rule, with new additions and modifications, illustrates how these structures continued to be living entities, adapting to new strategic needs and architectural styles. Today, it stands as a prominent landmark in the modern city of Saladin. Its ancient stones, now a backdrop for fishing boats and bustling markets, a silent witness to millennia of human activity. The enduring presence of these castles, even in ruin, also shaped the landscape and the memory of the region. Local folklore often incorporated the tales of the Frankish occupiers, sometimes demonizing them, sometimes romanticizing them, but always remembering them. The very names of some villages and geographical features in the Levant still echo the Frankish presence. These structures became part of the collective memory, silent monuments to a turbulent past. They drew the attention of early European travelers and antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries, who, often driven by a romanticized view of the Crusades, began to document and sketch these imposing ruins, thus initiating the modern study of Crusader architecture. The Castle of Belvoir, or Kokov Hayarden, overlooking the Jordan Valley, is another remarkable example. Built by the Hospitallers in the 12th century, its concentric design, with its massive walls and towers, was considered one of the most advanced of its time. After its surrender to Saladin in 1189, it was dismantled in places, but much of its structure remained. Its ruins, meticulously excavated in the 20th century, reveal the sophisticated planning and engineering that went into its construction, including an elaborate system of underground passages and storage chambers. The challenge for archaeologists has been to differentiate between the original Crusader construction and the later Mamluk modifications, as both groups used similar building materials and techniques. This blending of architectural styles often makes it difficult to definitively attribute certain features to one period or another, adding a layer of complexity to their study. The final chapter for many of these castles was not a dramatic siege, but a slow, almost imperceptible fading into the landscape. As the centuries turned and the strategic importance of fixed fortifications waned with the advent of gunpowder and mobile armies, their military function diminished. They became relics of a bygone era, their towering walls and deep moats more a testament to past power than a deterrent to future threats. Some were repurposed as prisons, others as administrative centers, and a few, like the Citadel of Jerusalem, continued to serve military functions in various forms well into the 20th century, their Crusader foundations supporting later Mamluk and Ottoman additions. The legacy of the Crusader castles in Jerusalem and the Levant is multifaceted. They are, first and foremost, monumental archaeological sites, offering invaluable insights into medieval military architecture, engineering, and daily life. They stand as tangible links to a complex period of religious fervor, political ambition, and cultural interaction. They remind us that the history of this region is a palimpsest, with layers of civilizations built one upon another, each leaving its indelible mark. These silent witnesses, whether crumbling on a remote hilltop or integrated into the fabric of a bustling modern city, continue to speak across the centuries, their stones echoing the footsteps of knights and sultans, pilgrims and conquerors, whispering tales of a time when faith and steel forged an unforgettable chapter in human history.